Once again, we are about to face a very, very important Parsha, because this Parsha, first of all, it's the purpose of the journey that Am Yisrael went through since the times of Yaakov, who went down to Egypt, the 12 tribes that went down to Egypt, and all of Am Yisrael that were enslaved in Egypt for 210 years. So finally, we are at the purpose of all of this. Am Yisrael are about to receive the Torah from Hashem. And not only that, but this is a new level, and this is where Hashem established a new connection with Am Yisrael. The definition of this connection is that Hashem chose us. And there is a very interesting medrash, a tale that our scholars tell us. They tell us that Am Yisrael were there under Mount Sinai. And they say under Mount Sinai is literally under Mount Sinai. It's not only at the edge of the mountain, but it was under the mountain, because Hashem basically picked up the mountain and placed it over Am Yisrael. And he told Am Yisrael, you have to receive the Torah. And if you will not receive the Torah, you will be buried under this mountain. That's a new connection. And if we think about it, it's not that Hashem wanted to welcome us in such a nice way, right? This isn't just about the welcoming. This is a bond. This is a special oath, a special connection. And we spoke about it once, that the connection is called the Bechira, choice. Hashem chose Am Yisrael. There's no way out of this deal anymore. This is a deep, strong connection that Hashem will go with us no matter what, in any place, under any circumstances. And this is our new connection from sons, from children of Hashem. That is the idea about lifting up Mount Sinai and placing it on top of Am Yisrael and forcing them in a certain way to actually receive the Torah. By the way, the Gemara, the Talmud tells us that because of Hashem forcing us to receive the Torah, we always have an excuse until the times of Purim. Our excuse could be that although Hashem, you are in the deal, but we aren't fully in the deal. You forced us to receive the Torah, but it wasn't out of our own accord. In the times of Purim, and we are soon about to approach Purim, in the times of Purim, what happened is that we decided to accept the Torah of our own accord. We had the choice to convert, and Haman wouldn't do anything because the command of the king Achashverosh was to kill all Jews. If you weren't a Jew, you converted, then you wouldn't die. But Am Yisrael, and Alter Rebbe says it, Baal HaTanya, he says it, that Am Yisrael did not even think about that option. Why? Because they did accept the Torah. Finally, there was the two sides that came together and both decided on receiving the Torah. So this is basically Matan Torah. This is where we are holding. This is what happened right there at that time. And it's very interesting because we have two stories that happened one story that happened right there at Matan Torah, and another story that happened right after that. There's a saying in Yiddish, it goes like this: a gast far a while, zet oif a mile, which means a guest for a moment can see a mile away, right? Sometimes if there's a guest that comes and he comes to a new place or whatever it is, he can sometimes see afar, which means he could basically notice all the gaps, all the disadvantages that are in a certain place, because he's coming from outside. The people that are in there, they are used to the way it works, and that's why they do not actually, they aren't able to notice all the things that are lacking and missing. But a guest can see it. Who was this guest? The guest was Yisro, Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, the Tzipora, Moshe Rabbeinu's wife. He was able to see something very, very interesting and pointed out to Moshe. And we'll talk about it in a moment, because that happened after Matan Torah. But there was already something that happened right there at Matan Torah. And the Medrash tells us that when Moshe Rabbeinu and Am Yisrael were there listening to Aseret HaDibros, to the 10 Commands, it started off in a way that Hashem himself said the 2 first Dibrot, the 2 first commands. Those 2 commands Hashem told Am Yisrael together with Moshe. And what happened was that each command that Hashem said, starting from Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Am Yisrael fainted. Am Yisrael, basically, they all collapsed, because they could not tolerate Hashem himself saying over the first command. And then Moshe Rabbeinu woke them up in some kind of Tchias HaMesim, rising from the dead. And then Hashem said the second Dibra, the second command, Lo yiyeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai. You should not have another God. And also then Am Yisrael heard it directly from Hashem, but they also died. They fainted for a moment. They woke up again and they told Moshe Rabbeinu enough. We want you to hear it from Hashem and you to give it over to us. We do not want to hear it directly from Hashem. We can't do it. We cannot do it. We cannot hear it from Hashem. It is too intense. It's too strong. It's too holy. We aren't on that level. Moshe Rabbeinu is very disappointed. Moshe Rabbeinu says, as Rashi explains, "Hitashtem es koichi kenakeva shenitzta'arti alechem urafisem es yod," which means that Am Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu expected Am Yisrael to be on a level where they could actually hear it from Hashem. And he said, "You disappoint me. You make me weep. I wanted you to hear it from Hashem, and instead you want me to hear it from Hashem and give it over to you secondhand." But Am Yisrael didn't want it in that way. So in order to understand what happened over there, let's talk about a general concept. And this is, it's a very interesting concept, because it's part of the Jewish lifestyle since Matan. After Jewish history, Am Yisrael always faced a challenge from those who said that we only believe the written Torah. The oral Torah, that is something that we do not accept. We don't accept it. We don't like rabbis to interpretate the meaning of the Torah. If it was in the times of the Tanaim, approximately we're talking about 2,000 years ago, the time of the Second Temple, but even before that, in the times of the First Temple. And this is probably something that started at a certain point when the tradition that was passed on to the next generation and to the following generation after that, and to the next generation, when the tradition started to become weak because people did not remember the exact tradition, people stopped following the tradition, or some people stopped following the tradition, and they said, don't interpretate the written Torah. And there are many, many examples. Mainly we see it in the Mishnah. One example is a famous story that happened in Beis Hamikdash, where the Kohen Gadol, the highest priest, what he did was basically during Sukkot, there is a special mitzvah to pour water on the altar, on the Mizbeach. And this isn't written in the written Torah. This is, again, the oral Torah, which is basically a tradition passed on from one generation to the other generation. And this priest did not hold of the oral Torah, basically. So instead of pouring the water on the Mizbeach, on the altar, what he did was basically he poured it on his foot on the side. Now the people noticed that. The people were looking at him, and they noticed that he poured it on his foot. They started throwing the esrogim, right? You've got an esrog there during Sukkot. They started throwing it on him, and they killed him in that way. Very interesting story that shows us that a lot of high people did not believe in the oral Torah. Not only that, when do we start counting the Omer? We know that after Pesach, we always count 49 days until Shavuot, until receiving the Torah. Why? So we learned it in the previous Parsha that Am Yisrael were basically waiting to receive the Torah, and they were looking forward for this, and that's why they counted the days. Basically, what happened was that it says in the written Torah, it says Mimacharas HaShabbos, which means the day after Shabbos, start counting the Torah. What is the day after Shabbos? Today, Sunday. So those who follow the written Torah without the interpretation of the oral Torah, of the scholars and the tradition of each generation, they said you count the Omer not a day after Passover as we do today, a day after Shabbos, which means on Sunday. And this is a total mistake. We know according to tradition that the meaning of the written Torah, Mimacharas HaShabbos, is referring to the sabbatical of the Passover. And this is another place where we can see the argument between, they were called the Tzdokim, they were called the Baitosim, which are basically cults that did not follow the oral Torah, they did not follow the tradition, the Masechah. And we know that a big part, and this is now the point that we're getting to, and we can see it in Matan Torah, a big part of our Judaism is the tradition. The tradition, the Masechah, the smicha as we call it, the smicha that a person receives from his rabbi received it from his rabbi until Moshe Rabbeinu. Today, smicha is basically when you basically become a rabbi. You become a rabbi and you can paskin halacha, which means you can actually tell people what does the halacha say. What is smicha? Smicha comes from the word v'samach yodo al rosh hapar, which means you are leaning your hands on that other person. Lismoch, to rely. But not only to rely, actually also to put your hands on top of him like they used to do to the offerings in the temple. That's the idea of smicha. That's why it's important to get it from a rabbi that's got a good smicha, that has, for example, there's the Rabbanut Smicha today. The official Rabbanut Smicha of Israel is an authority that gives out the smicha from the chief rabbis, basically. They test you and they see that you know the halacha, and that's how they pass on the tradition for thousands and thousands of years until Moshe Rabbeinu himself, because Moshe Rabbeinu gave smicha to his student Yehoshua. Yehoshua gave it on to his student, and so on and so on for thousands of generations. This smicha is basically the whole idea of the true Torah, which is relying on tradition. According to certain rules that the Torah gives us, you can't make innovations in the Torah without permission, without the strict laws, the strict tools that the Torah gives you. The Torah itself provides you with the tools to interpret the written Torah. And that's why we can see in the Talmud, it's very interesting to see it. You read in the Talmud, sometimes you can find that Rav said something. Rav was one of the biggest Amoraim. He was already after the destruction of the second temple, and he lived in Babylon. And sometimes he said a certain statement. Then there was another student that questioned this statement of Rav. So what happened is, the Gemara says, Shasik Rav. Rav was silent. He had no answer. He did not know what to reply to the student. But nevertheless, he did not change his sack. He did not change his decision. He did not change the minhag. Why? Because that's what he accepted. So although you might have a question on that tradition, on that minhag, why do we do it in that way? And there are many questions. But there's an expression, a very famous expression from Reb Chaim Brisker. Reb Chaim Brisker, he was a great Talmid Chacham, a great scholar, that he was known to be very sharp-minded. In the yeshivas today, they all learn him. And he lived not long ago. He lived 100 years ago, approximately 120, 150, 120 years ago, I would say. Yeah. What we talk about 100 years ago, 120, something like that. And he lived and he wrote a very interesting chidushim. He had an expression, because as we know, if you walk into a beis medrash, if you walk into a yeshiva hall, if you walk into a shir, if you walk into our bet midrash Rechavia in the morning, you'll see that there are many questions. People always ask questions, and this is a typical Jewish thing. They say, why does a Jew answer a question with another question? And the answer is, well, why not? So we like to ask questions, but Reb Chaim Brisker said, for nakashya starbednit, which means that from a question, we don't die. No one dies from a question. You can have a question. Sometimes the question won't even be answered. But nevertheless, it does not change what we know. It does not change our Messiahs. It does not change our tradition. It does not change our minhag. Where does this come from? Where does this idea of the oral Torah, where does the importance of tradition, not only tradition, but the idea of tradition is interpreting the written Torah. It is not only that, but it's me and you being able to innovate in the Torah itself, to come up with new ideas. And this is something that the Rebbe always put a big emphasis on, writing the Torah. If you have a certain explanation to what the Torah says in the Parsha, you did it according to the method that the Torah allows us, write it down. That's a great thing. Each soul, each group of Torah has to be part of our mission. Souls are not complete. To the Torah. It's going to be according to the rules. We have to things that don't have anybody. But if you want to explain a certain question, great. That's a very good thing to do. Important to do. Your part in it is very important as well. Guys in Babylon explain different ideas in the Torah. The purpose of that is to give our input, to be part of the Torah. That we should also feel a part of this wisdom of Hashem. That is the combination between on one hand, sticking to the tradition, and basically sticking to the tradition is going according to, we don't cancel laws before because we don't understand something or because we have a question. But on the other hand, we can add and we can explain certain ideas in the Torah according to our understanding. And the Torah wants us to do that. Hashem wants us to do that. Hashem wants us to bring our own vision on certain things. That's why rabbis in our generation, it's great that they write books. It's great that they bring their own vision of understanding what's written in the Torah. Once again, it's got to be according to tradition. We can't make up things. But on the other hand, the idea of oral Torah, the Torah Shabbat Peh, the Messiah, the tradition is that if we go according to the set of tools that the Torah gives us, we can interpretate and add to the Torah. So where does this come from? Where does this come from? The truth is that this comes from the discussion between Moshe Rabbeinu and Am Yisrael right after the second command. Hashem says once again, the first command, Am Yisrael faint. The second command, they faint again. And Am Yisrael tells Moshe Rabbeinu, we are very sorry, but it's enough. We are very sorry that we cannot stand where you are standing and receive the Torah from Hashem. By the way, they heard it directly. The first two ones they heard, but they did not want that. Why? What is that? What is the reason that they stopped Moshe? And Moshe was disappointed. But they told Moshe Rabbeinu, we want to have our own feeling about the Torah. We don't want it. We don't want the Torah to overtake our existence, to cancel our existence, to cause us to faint. We want to be a part of it. We want to get it slowly but surely, try and understand it in our own vessels, in our own kalim, in our own minds, without just hearing it from Hashem in these loud microphones or whatever they were. It was a better sound than this, that's for sure. But we want to hear it in our own small vessels, in our own small minds. Yes, we could accept these amazing Dibrei commands directly from Hashem. We can. And we'll hear it. We might faint afterwards, but we'll rely on you that you'll wake us up. And we'll hear it. We'll hear Kabed es avicha ve'esimecha, respect your mother and father, do not murder, do not keep the Shabbos, for example. We'll hear everything, but it won't be in our way. It won't be in our understanding. It would be from above. It would be from Hashem. We want you to hear it from Hashem because you are on that level, and then translate it to us. Give it to us slowly. That is the idea of the discussion between and Moshe Rabbeinu was disappointed, yes, because he wanted to upgrade, to lift Am Yisrael up to his level. He wanted them to hear it directly from Hashem. For Moshe Rabbeinu, that was perfect because Moshe Rabbeinu's tools, his vessels, his understanding was on a higher level. He wanted to upgrade Am Yisrael. Come join me and let's all together listen directly from Hashem. And if you faint, don't worry, I'll wake you up. Am Yisrael says no. We want a part in the Torah. We want our part in the Torah. We don't want you to upgrade us and to lift us up. It's great. It's very special. But nevertheless, we still want our own understanding. That is the discussion between Moshe Rabbeinu and and Am Yisrael. And let's go back and let's end with Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law comes to see Moshe Rabbeinu, and he arrives after. There's an argument about it. Some say that he arrives before, some say that he arrives after. It's actually an interesting argument. And here we said that a guest that comes from afar, he can see far away, which means he can notice a lot of things that are missing and lacking. And Yisro, the father of Moshe, the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, notices something very weird. He sees Moshe Rabbeinu right after Matan Torah, right after receiving the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu stood from morning till night explaining to Am Yisrael the Torah. And this seems very weird, because Yisro tells Moshe Rabbeinu, how could you stand there from morning till night explaining? It will drain all of your powers. Am Yisrael also won't have the time to wait in these long lines, asking each one his questions. Why don't you do? He came up with this suggestion, a very interesting and a great suggestion. And he tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you know what? Start giving smicha. Start explaining to other rabbis certain laws, and they will judge the people. If there's anything that they don't know, they'll come to you. But don't stand there from morning till night trying to explain the Torah to everyone. This is something that will drain all of your powers. Not you nor Am Yisrael will benefit from it. That's the same point that we just spoke about now. The idea of smicha, the idea of giving the Torah over to many other people so they, in their mind, in their understanding, will be able to connect to the Torah, teach others the Torah, and at the end of the day, that is why, till this very day, we can also teach the Torah. Because if Moshe Rabbeinu would keep it to himself, if he would be the only one to judge Am Yisrael and to explain to them the entire Torah, he'll have everything. Of course, he could do it. Moshe Rabbeinu is great. He could teach all of Am Yisrael. He could upgrade them to his level. But what would be with the generation that went into Eretz Yisrael? Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't there anymore. What would be to the generation after that, after the times of Joshua? What would be to the generation of King David? And what would be with the generation that we are in now, over 3,000 years from Matan Torah? So that's why Hashem decided to listen to Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. Very interesting. This idea was accepted by Hashem, it was accepted by Moshe, and that's when they started to give smicha, where Moshe Rabbeinu authorized other people from the Jewish nation to tell them what is the halacha. That's where the oral Torah basically started. It actually started a bit before, when Moshe Rabbeinu accepted all. Hashem gave him the Torah, the book of the Torah, but he also gave him instructions, how to read the Torah, how to learn the Torah, how to interpret the Torah. And that is the instructions that we use till this very day. Thank you very much for taking part in the shir, and looking forward, Be'ezrat Hashem, next week on Sunday. Thank you. Shavua Tov.